Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Matt Balker coming to you as a profounder professor. And today I would like to explain, if I can, a great line and a fascinating idea by Wilfred Bion, who was an English psychoanalyst who rose to prominence really in the mid 20th century. Idea is this, that groups tend to elect the most psychologically sick members as their leaders. It was an idea that fascinated me in graduate school, thinking about political theory, political science, elections, popular persuasion, political psychology, sociology, everything. I think it's a fascinating and really actually wonderfully succinct way of putting a problem. The issue with this particular quote, and it might even be a throwaway line if you don't understand the reasoning behind it, is that you do have to understand a teeny bit about Bion and his overall structural theory of groups and regression to understand why this idea makes sense. And I'm just going to explain that really quick. So Bion thought that any group he really worked with small unstructured groups, but I think some of his logic can be applied to larger groups as well. That's a kind of another discussion, and it depends on how structured, how task oriented, how regimented, how much tradition is going on behind the group, what's the leadership structure like, et cetera, et cetera. But for small unstructured groups, at least to keep it safe, we can say that there are some groups who will remain sophisticated, mature, and task oriented, meaning that the purpose of the group is to complete a group task, a work task together. And a bonus is that if the group is highly intelligent and emotionally sensitive, it will find a way to gratify its members by their participation. Their participation in the group will not be a complete sacrifice. They'll also find some personal source of gratification in the group. That's not the primary goal of the group. Um, Unfortunately, sophisticated, mature task group work groups do not remain that way forever, and they often face dilemmas, problems, roadblocks that stand in their way of completing their task or doing their work. There could be a crisis of leadership. There could be some conflict in the group. Somebody could break out and say something neurotic or psychotic that threatens the stability of the group. There are a number of things that could happen in the group's processing that can throw off the dynamic of the group and throw it off of its task. When this happens, Bion suggested that really the group regresses the same way that an individual who faces a crisis may risk regressing to a more primitive form of mental and psychological functioning. And so the repressed groups that Bion believed that these sophisticated task groups would or could fall into really fell into three categories. He called them basic assumption groups. And that terminology is a little confusing to some because it sounds like he's talking about a different group altogether. What he's really talking about is the same number of people or the same people just functioning at a different level, functioning at a level of operating on basic assumptions rather than on sophisticated work tasks, collaboration, communication, empathy, etc. So the three basic assumption groups are the first, and I think maybe to me maybe most common, or at least in my experience, is the basic assumption of dependency. And this is where the group gets together and unconsciously decides, because it's regressed, remember, that its goal now is just to behave sort of like an infant and wait for sustenance or something good to come from someone outside the group, the leader of the group, the structure of the group, someone in power in the group. But their basic function is to come and to the group and be dependent and depend on someone to provide them what they need. This, if you're a teacher or a professor, you may notice that sometimes if you have a first day of class that feels a little bit passive, that there may be some anxieties about that group and what's happening in the group that throws the group into a basic assumption of dependency where everyone decides that it's their job just to sit there passively and not contribute creatively to what's happening in the room but rather to sit and just wait for the professor to govern things, to settle anxieties, to solve problems, to present material, et cetera, et cetera. So the second and slightly more complicated basic assumption group that Bion identified was called pairing. And this is where two or more, usually it's two though, individuals in the group seem to have a special relationship. And that relationship can be both real and imagined. It can be where two individuals just have a certain rapport with each other, or maybe they even have a kind of a adversarial relationship in the group. Um, but one way or another, the group decides that this couple is going to create through its pairing, which it imagines in erotic terms, even though there may not be anything erotic going on in reality in the group. The group imagines it as a regressed group, remember, in these kind of primitive, almost childlike terms, as a kind of a mother-father pair or a two-parent pair that will create a messianic child, an intellectual baby of sorts, or a psychological baby that will save the group from its troubles. The pairing assumption relies on this coupling happening and on the pairing of the couple to create something new for the group to survive off of, to focus its attention on, to redirect it, to keep it together. And it should be mentioned that one of the primary assumptions, if you will, of a basic assumption group is that groups should stay together and that their group should remain together. And one of the primary motivations for a lot of primitive group behavior is simply the survival of the group itself. So groups are not meant to split apart or fall apart or splinter or shatter. And this threatens a lot about groups in primitive states because it seems to suggest that you might fall apart yourself if you're functioning at that level. If the group falls apart, then everything falls apart, and your identity falls apart, and your ability to communicate falls apart, and it becomes very important that the group do whatever it can to keep the group surviving, even if on a sophisticated level it might be better, say, for the group to disband or postpone its activities or do something like that. That's going to face a lot of resistance at a primitive level. The third basic assumption of Bion's was fight or flight, which we all know to be a common term now used to describe a lot of people who are struggling with anxiety or panic. The fight or flight assumption is really just what it sounds like. It's that there's something in the group that is toxic, or there's something or someone or some process or some idea or some problem in the group that is presenting the group with a survival level threat, and that survival level threat is going to risk what I have just spoken about, which is risk the integrity and the survival of the group as a group. The solution for that becomes to take on a posture of extreme sort of paranoia, extreme, really schizoid function of kind of us, them, good, bad, black and white. Um, we, this part of the group or this aspect of the group want to stay together, whereas this part of the group or that aspect of the group wants us to fall apart, or something outside the group is threatening the group, and all of us have to stick together and we have to retain our commitments or restate our commitments or reinforce our commitments to each other in order to stay alive. And that means that the third basic assumption tends to be a pretty hostile, aggressive, um, uh, paranoia laden basic assumption group. Um, those three groups cover a lot of ground if you're working with unstructured groups. I think you'll find there's some variation. Sometimes you'll see patterns in your groups that don't fit any of the assumptions, and they could be permutations or they could be just something else altogether. But they do seem, in my experience at least, to cover a good deal of ground in working with smaller unstructured groups. A lot of the things and phenomena that you see will fall into one of those categories. Now, the reason that we started with the line about leaders being the most psychologically sick members is because, from a basic assumption standpoint, from a regressed standpoint, the person or persons who are going to seem the most uh, adept at leading the group through its struggle, let's say, of a fight or flight pattern, are going to be the most highly paranoid, the most highly schizoid, the most aggressive, the most assertive. maybe the most schizoid members of the group itself. And so these psychologically um, regressed individuals are going to be the ones that that take prominence in the group and find places of leadership in the group in directing the group's activities down those channels, which are themselves sort of regressive channels. So the line makes sense if you adopt a standpoint like Bion's, which is that groups can move from sophisticated levels of thinking and acting to less sophisticated levels. And it's really at those less sophisticated levels that the leaders become more and more appealing, the more they fit the pattern of basic assumption that we have established in the group. So if it's a dependent group and there's, I don't know, hostility against withholding by the group's leader or something, the most hostile members are going to find a voice. And if it's a pairing group, it's going to be someone who thinks most imaginatively and creatively and maybe even exuberantly about what is going to happen when this pair finally multiplies and does its thing and saves the group from disaster. And so you get a pattern where, uh, to the group's own detriment, it finds itself in a position of looking toward individuals for leadership who are, in fact, going to lead the group further and further into its regression and solidify its regression, meaning it will be that much harder for the group to return to a more sophisticated, mature, safe, environmentally and emotionally kind of stable situation or uh, circumstance. That's the drama of groups a la Wilfred Bion, and I think that makes sense of the Great Line. And I think we can see today, if you wanted to speculate rather wildly, that we could apply even some of this to national politics and look at the kind of leaders that we happen to have in, say, the United States at the moment, and notice some of their characteristics and the way that the groups that support them seem to have rather regressive fantasies about what's happening in the world and seem to have rather black or white opinions about what's good or bad. It seems to be willing to defend a leader, even if the leader does things that are in gray areas. Those are no longer seen as gray areas. They're seen as either fake news or they're turned around and seen as positive attributes or whatever. And so we can still see that fit between a regression in thinking and mature feeling, mature emoting and relating, and um, a leader to be chosen who is him or herself an embodiment of that kind of regressive thinking.